Prime Minister Meloni has thrown her lot in with Joe Biden and the United States of America, even at the cost of relations with other members of the European Union. But that is proving no defense to the thousands upon thousands, 10,000 in the last 2 days of illegal immigrants from Africa arriving in Lampedusa. Mind you, it's not so long ago when the Italians were invading Africa, but this time they were armed to the teeth and intent on conquest. Yes, that's right. The Italians in Libya, the Italians in Abyssinia, remember that in particular. The Italians were once a great colonizing power and thought nothing of invading African territories, and indeed other territories, like Albania, for example. I'm not even going to touch on the period of Roman conquest when Italy conquered most of the world, certainly much of Europe, except Scotland, where they built a wall to keep us out. Hadrian's Wall, it's called, although Hadrian himself never laid a brick of it. I make the point to counterpoint the French invasion of Africa, which is apparently imminent. And that's not the first French invasion of Africa either. Otherwise, half of West Africa would not be francophone today, would not be using the French franc as their compulsory currency, would not be forced to deposit their sovereign wealth in French banks, and would not be selling for 80 cents a kilogram uranium that actually costs 200 euros per kilogram on the open international market. I mention Niger by allusion because that's where the French are planning to invade. I think they'll have a very hard time, not just against the Niger army, but the Niger people, and the Burkina Faso army, and the Burkinabe people, and people in the neighboring parts of Nigeria who are entirely the same people as live across the imperialist drawn border in Little Niger. I look forward to the French getting a bloody good hiding. I'll make no apology for saying so. There is no case for France to invade Niger for the sake of what? 198 euros and 20 cents a kilogram. It's time for France to accept that its days in power, both as a direct colonizer and then as an indirect colonizer, are over. And the African people have every right, indeed every duty, to rise up against the European colonialist army that appears to be gathering. A gunboat has just arrived in neighboring Benin, and there are reports of French armed formations forming up in certain West African countries. Shame on those. Shame on those. But the big story tonight, apart from the 9/11 anniversary, to which I shall turn in a moment, is the storm that is brewing in the Kremlin, as the midnight oil is being burned, as the Russian government decides how to respond to the potentially world historic attack last night on the Russian Navy in Sebastopol in Crimea. In 1854, Britain and France attacked that very place, and the Russians made a stand there. It's called the Defense of Sebastopol. Look it up. The French and the British chose that moment and that place to attack that which they thought was the heart of the Russian Empire at the time. The Russians have never forgotten it, even if most of you have never heard of it. The European powers invaded Russia time and time and time again. It's the principal reason why Russia will not accept the presence of NATO in the Ukraine on its borders, because invaders have traditionally invaded Russia from those territories. If you can't see that, you're probably willfully blind. If you can't understand that, then whilst you may have the defense of being stupid, it's unlikely that that defense will pass muster. The Russians know that Crimea, which is indeed their heart, and which has been the fortress of the Russian Navy since before the United States of America existed, will never be surrendered, and therefore can only be attacked, and only when in dry dock, and therefore bereft of anti-missile weapons with which to bring down any attacking force. But the big thing about last night's attack on Sebastopol was that it was a British attack on Crimea again. 1854, 2023 are days that will live in infamy, in the Russian character, in the Russian body politic, and in Russian intentions, which are right now being hammered out in the Kremlin. 10 British Storm Shadow cruise missiles were launched at the Black Sea Fleet in Sebastopol last night. 7 of them, it's said, were brought down. None of us can know exactly what came down and exactly what got through. And it is indeed an embarrassment to Russia that 3 missiles at least hit their targets, hit a warship and hit a submarine, both of them in dry dock, and causing death and destruction and massive photogenic fires, which the Ukrainians have put to good use in their propaganda work today. But this was not a Ukrainian attack. These cruise missiles were given to Ukraine precisely for the purpose of attacking Crimea and other Russian territories. Long-range missiles that have to be carried by an aircraft from an airfield, which the British were undoubtedly involved in targeting and in maintaining. This British attack on Russia will not go unanswered if I'm any judge, and I may not be. But if I am any judge of the Russian character, and I have been close to Russia for more than 50 years of my life, I think I know them at least as well as Mr. James Cleverly in the British Foreign Office. It's my view that they will regard this as a direct act of war by Britain against Russia. They will not accept that the hands on the joystick of the airplane that launched them may or even may not have been Ukrainian. They will regard these missiles and the precision with which they were delivered as a British affair, as a British job. And tonight, right now, the Kremlin lights are still twinkling as decisions are made about how to respond. I take no pleasure in that, for I do not believe that the British government is acting with the best interests of the British people in mind. Neither were the British people consulted about this act of war. Even the British rubber stamp Parliament was not consulted about it. Perhaps there was no need. There's no opposition, none at all, inside the British Parliament. How different from the day that the Labour opposition stopped David Cameron in his tracks when he was about to launch a blizzard of cruise missiles on the Syrian Arab Republic only a few years ago. Now there is no one, not one, not a mover, not a seconder, let alone a teller, to muster any opposition to the British government's actions. But I think that Britain is going to pay for this attack on Sebastopol. It may be tomorrow, it may be next week, it may be next year, but I believe that Britain is going to pay a price for its irredentist, insane hostility towards Russia, which has stretched unbroken, except for a brief period when Russia was lying drunk on the floor and having its pocket picked under Boris Yeltsin, unbroken since 1854. And indeed even before that, since the time of Catherine the Great. That peculiar ancient hatred of the British ruling elite for the people of Russia, a ruling elite now joined by juvenile Trotskyite scribblers in the British trade union movement at their Congress in Liverpool this week. This hatred of Russia will not go unreciprocated. And we'll be here as the mother of all talk shows to tell you what seems to have been decided in the Kremlin this evening. That is, if we're all still here. Speaking of storms, a storm has swept away thousands of lives in eastern Libya. I mention it because there was a time, not that long ago, when our concern for the Libyan people was, well, overwhelming, so overwhelming that we had to invade Libya and destroy its government and blow its bloody doors off and murder its leader because we were so concerned about the poor people in Benghazi who were about to face an invasion from the west, from Tripoli, from the forces under Colonel Gaddafi. Do you remember it? Benghazi, actually, another auspicious anniversary when the American embassy was attacked and several of the American diplomats were murdered in cold blood. And Hillary Clinton didn't even pick up the phone because she'd left the embassy all but naked as the hordes of Libyan Islamist fanatics surrounded it. But all that sympathy, empathy, all that concern for the people of Libya would appear to have evaporated overnight. The thousands now being washed up on the beach in Libya go almost completely unremarked in the very same media that was filled wall to wall with the need to invade Libya just a decade or so ago out of our concern, our tender hearts for the fate of the Libyan people. Not a finger has been raised in support, in defense, in assistance for the people of Libya. A very good example, because it's time that people realize that which is a huge elephant in the room, namely that our concern and the news agenda for one area after area, one people after people, one tyrant after tyrant, one new Hitler after new Hitler is entirely transitory, entirely self-serving, and entirely fleeting. When the moment comes that that people, that country, that cause célèbre has been deemed past its sell-by date, the wheeling and turning is done with the precision of the brigade of guards. No one even feels a clunk as they wheel away and onto a new item, a new issue in the news agenda. Why do I mention that? Well, let's take Mr. Juan Guaido. You've probably forgotten him. But the British government, the European Union, the American government, the Bank of England, the courts in Chancery Lane, all decreed that Juan Guaido was the new president of Venezuela, and more importantly, was thereby the heir to the very considerable sovereign wealth of the people of Venezuela, which was all handed over to Mr. Juan Guaido. The fact that Juan Guaido was not even the leader of the opposition in Venezuela, never mind the president, the fact that nobody in Venezuela regarded him as the president of the country, the fact that nobody ever cast a single vote for him as president of Venezuela, he was deemed to be the president of Venezuela and given $1 billion, $2 billion worth of Venezuela's gold by the Bank of England, in parenthesis, guaranteeing that only a grade 1 idiot abroad would ever deposit a penny of their sovereign wealth in London again. This matter was fought out in the courts, and the courts found in favor of Juan Guaido. Where now is Juan Guaido? He's a student at a college in Florida, USA. Long forgotten in Venezuela, but not forgotten by those of us with a memory longer than that of a gnat. We can remember many other such stooges that were for a fleeting moment the great white hope of empire. There's a man now enjoying undreamt of wealth who was just a year and 4 months ago the president of Afghanistan, so-called, who left with sacks full of banknotes of every denomination overnight as a dismal, grisly end to a 20-year war and occupation of Afghanistan closed. Closed just like that. All those tens of thousands who lost their lives, all those trillions of dollars that we spent in 20 years was over almost in a heartbeat, although many a heart stopped beating on that final day. The truth is, we never cared a fig about the people of Afghanistan. We punished them twice. First, by supporting the fathers of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and putting them into power in the first place, and then punished them all over again after 9/11. I'm going to talk about 9/11 tonight. Not the 9/11 1973, though that occupied me very greatly at the time, when American supplied jets with Americans in the Situation Room in the White House oversaw and coordinated the overthrow of the elected socialist Prime Minister Salvador Allende. May God rest his sweet soul. That's for another time. Tonight I want to remember the second 9/11. I want to remember the nearly 3,000 innocent Americans who lost their lives in the Twin Towers. I want to remember the hundreds of innocent passengers who boarded airliners only to discover that they were destined for a dreadful demise at the end of their journey. I want to remember the firefighters and the police officers and hundreds of sundry others, many of whom had no duty to do so at all, ran towards the flames, ran towards the disaster that they could see with their own eyes, even as the buildings crumbled and fell. These brave men and women plunged to their deaths trying to rescue others. I want to remember also all of the events that led up to this act of mass murder, terrorist mass murder on 9/11. And I want to call for a new inquiry to answer the unanswered questions which have grown and grown in proportion over these last 20 years. You see, not many people now believe the official narrative. There are more holes in it than a Swiss cheese. And those holes have got to be closed. And any presidential candidate who makes as their proposal in their platform to reopen the issues that have not gone away about 9/11 will certainly reap support at the ballot box from the millions of Americans who no longer believe that official narrative. It has soured faster than the narrative that said there was no conspiracy to kill President John F. Kennedy, whose anniversary we will also mark in November on the mother of all talk shows. Now, when I talk about holes, I'm not one of these who pretends they didn't see the airplanes strike the Twin Towers. I did. And I've since seen it from several different angles. Those who describe these planes as CGI planes inserted by the US government or by television are either fools or knaves, insulting the memory of those who died, insulting the memory of those who were on the planes and lost. I don't know in their theory whether all these people are still alive on a love island somewhere in the Caribbean or in the Pacific. But it's a big insult to say that planes didn't hit those Twin Towers. But who was flying those planes is an increasingly open question. Who, where, are Al-Qaeda is an increasingly open question. The skill with which these aeroplanes struck these buildings without navigational aid, but their own flying skill alone, is highly suspicious to me. Building 7, which fell down in its own footprint when struck with no planes at all, is very suspicious to me. The plane that hit the Pentagon doesn't look like a plane to me. And if a plane, the striking of a target so low by some fledgling Arab local flight school graduate with no graduation certificate who couldn't land a plane, is very suspicious to me. The conduct of the Bush administration in the days immediately after 9/11 are very suspicious to me. The use to which 9/11 was put to murder millions of people all over the Muslim world is very suspicious to me. Who these hijackers were, who they were really working for, is very suspicious to me and to millions across the world, not the least in the United States of America, not the least in New York City, where most of the killing took place. So I believe it's time, more than time, to start a proper debate and to try and fill in these dreadful, awful holes. It's going to be a bumpy night. Fasten your seatbelts. It's the mother of all talk shows.